Midnight, June 6, 1944. The sky over Normandy is alive with the sound of engines. Hundreds of C-47s droning through black clouds toward enemy territory. Inside each plane sit American paratroopers, their faces lit only by the glow of red cabin lights. No one speaks. They can hear the wind howl through the fuselage, the rattle of equipment, the quiet rhythm of hearts beating faster with every mile. These are the men of the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, America's elite. Their orders: drop behind enemy lines, seize bridges and crossroads, cut German reinforcements, and hold the ground until the invasion force breaks through from the beaches. Outside, flak bursts bloom like fireflowers in the sky. A pilot shouts over the roar of the engines, "Hold on!" The plane jolts violently. A shell tears past the wing. Red tracer rounds rip through the night. The jump light turns green. The door slides open. Cold wind floods the cabin. One by one, the paratroopers step into the darkness, disappearing into a storm of flak and fear. They fall through clouds, their parachutes snapping open under the moonlight. The night below them burns, a patchwork of fires, tracers, and flashes of artillery. Many are scattered miles from their intended drop zones. Some never make it to the ground alive. Others land in swamps, trees, or enemy-held fields, alone and disoriented. Sergeant Bill Calhoun hits the ground hard, cuts himself free, and checks his compass. Nothing. He hears gunfire nearby and the cries of men calling for their units. Somewhere in the darkness, he spots another trooper crawling through tall grass. "You 101st?" Calhoun whispers. The man nods. 2 soldiers out of 1,000. But a start. Across the countryside, similar scenes unfold. Small bands of paratroopers gather, lost and scattered, but never frozen. They know the mission: secure the causeways, the bridges, and the roads leading inland from Utah Beach. If they fail, the landing force will be trapped on the sand. By dawn, the first light reveals a countryside torn apart. Farmhouses smolder. Cows wander through the smoke. German patrols move cautiously along hedgerows, searching for the ghosts that dropped from the sky. Then, out of nowhere, the Americans strike. A squad of Screaming Eagles ambushes a German convoy at a crossroads near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. Grenades explode. Machine gun fire rips through the morning mist. Within minutes, the road is blocked. Mission 1 complete. Miles away, near Carentan, Lieutenant Dick Winters regroups with a handful of men. No radios, no maps, just instinct. They stumble upon a German artillery battery. 4 105mm guns pounding the beaches where the invasion is unfolding. Winters counts 12 enemy soldiers, maybe more. His group has 12 men too. Even odds. He signals the attack. They crawl from ditches, mud soaking their uniforms. A German sentry turns, eyes wide. Too late. The Americans open fire, charging through the smoke. Grenades arc through the air, bursting inside the gun pits. The fight is savage, close quarters. When it's over, all 4 guns are silent. The beachhead is safe. The victory at Brickcourt Manor will become one of the most famous small unit actions in American military history. As the sun climbs higher, the scattered paratroopers link up, forming makeshift platoons. No one has slept. Many have not eaten since boarding the planes in England. Yet they move, village to village, clearing houses and digging in. In the town of Carentan, the Germans counterattack with tanks and infantry. The 101st is outgunned, outnumbered, and exhausted, but they hold. Every alley becomes a battlefield, every doorway a bunker. Soldiers fire until their rifles smoke, then grab fallen weapons to keep fighting. When reinforcements finally arrive, the Americans still stand, their uniforms black with soot and blood, but unbroken. Back on the beaches, news spreads fast. The Airborne has succeeded. The causeways are open. The landings are secure. The invasion can continue inland. Without those few hundred men holding the line in the hedgerows, D-Day might have collapsed before it began. That night, under a fading sky, the paratroopers dig foxholes outside the villages they captured. Some write letters home by candlelight. Others simply stare into the dark, listening to the distant rumble of artillery. They think of friends who never made the jump, of chutes that never opened, of screams lost in the wind. For the men of the 101st Airborne, Normandy is just the beginning. Ahead lies Carentan, Bastogne, and the long road to Hitler's Germany. But on that first night, scattered, outnumbered, and surrounded, they proved something to the world, that courage is not about certainty, but resolve. In the years after the war, veterans would gather and remember that night. They'd laugh about the chaos, the missed drop zones, the wild luck of finding comrades in the dark. But behind the laughter lay silence, the kind that only soldiers know, because every man who jumped that night understood how easily he could have been left behind, another parachute tangled in a tree. The German commanders never recovered from the shock. The ghost soldiers, they called them. Americans who appeared from nowhere, cutting communication lines, destroying artillery, sowing confusion across the countryside. By the time dawn fully broke, the Nazi defenses were already crumbling, the myth of invincibility shattered. When asked years later what gave them the strength to keep moving through that chaos, one veteran simply said, "We had each other. That was enough." And maybe that's the truth of the 101st Airborne. Their real weapon wasn't their rifles or grenades, but the bond that made them unstoppable. Ordinary young Americans, farmers, factory workers, sons of small towns, who jumped into the heart of darkness and changed history before their boots ever touched the ground. The beaches of Normandy became a symbol of liberation, but before the first wave ever landed, before the flag ever rose over France, the night sky belonged to the screaming eagles. They were the first to fight, the first to bleed, and because of them, the dawn came for freedom.
The sun rose over Normandy on June 7, 1944, pale, cold, and heavy with smoke. The air was still thick with the smell of gunpowder and burning fields. In the hedgerows, the men of the 101st Airborne crouched low, rifles ready, eyes fixed on the roads leading inland. They were scattered, exhausted, and still unsure how far they'd actually advanced. But they knew one thing: they weren't going back. The night had turned into legend already. Hundreds of Americans had dropped into the dark, alone, hunted and surrounded, and somehow carved a foothold in Hitler's fortress Europe. But now came the part no one could train for: holding it. At dawn, the German army began to move. Tanks clattered through the narrow lanes, their engines echoing like thunder through the valley. Infantry followed behind, gray uniforms, confident, disciplined. They had fought on the Eastern Front. They had crushed resistance before. To them, the Americans were just boys with parachutes. But the boys were waiting. Hidden among the hedgerows, the paratroopers watched the enemy approach, hearts pounding, fingers resting on triggers slick with sweat. Lieutenant Winters raised his hand, then whispered, "Wait for it." The first German tank rolled into the kill zone. A bazooka fired from behind a barn, a flash, a roar, and the tank burst into flame. The ambush erupted. Machine guns chattered, grenades flew, shouts filled the air. For a moment, it was chaos. Smoke, shouting, the scream of metal tearing apart. When it cleared,
The road was littered with twisted steel and motionless gray shapes. They had held the line. But holding it once wasn't enough. Every hour brought new attacks. The Germans struck from every direction, desperate to push the Americans back into the sea before reinforcements could land. The 101st fought from field to field, hedgerow to hedgerow, every meter paid for in blood. In the village of Carentan, the fighting turned house to house. The streets were narrow, choked with debris. Windows flashed with muzzle fire. Bullets whined off cobblestones. American medics dragged the wounded through doorways while German snipers picked targets from church towers. The smell of cordite and smoke mixed with the stench of mud and fear. Private Joe Toy leaned against a stone wall, gasping for breath, his helmet dented, uniform soaked. "Feels like the whole damn Wehrmacht's in this town," he muttered. Beside him, a corporal grinned through cracked lips. "Then we'll send 'em home early." They pushed forward, one street at a time. Grenades cleared rooms, rifles barked from behind barricades. Civilians hid in basements, clutching their children, praying the battle would pass. Above them, the church bell tower, shattered by artillery, tolled once before collapsing in a shower of dust. For 3 days the fighting never stopped. Rain fell, ammunition ran low. Sleep was a luxury no one could afford. Yet the 101st refused to give an inch. They were fighting not for ground, but for survival, and for the men next to them. On the 4th morning, the Germans came again. Tanks leading, infantry screaming in. The paratroopers braced for what they thought would be their final stand. Then, through the haze, came the distant rumble of engines. American Shermans from the 2nd Armored Division charging into the fray. The cavalry had arrived. Cheers broke out through the smoke as tanks rolled into Carentan, guns blazing. The Germans faltered, then broke. What began as a slaughter turned into a rout. Within hours, the town was free. When silence finally fell, the streets of Carentan were a ruin. Walls pocked with bullet holes, windows shattered, the air heavy with dust. The men of the 101st sat where they stood, too tired to move, too wired to sleep. Some stared at nothing. Some prayed. Others simply lit cigarettes with shaking hands. Winters walked through the wreckage, counting heads, noting names. So many were gone. But those who remained had done what no one thought possible. They had held the town, secured the road to Utah and Omaha, and linked the beachheads. Because of them, D-Day had not failed. Later, when asked how they managed it, one officer simply said, "We didn't have a choice. If we didn't stop them, nobody would." Word of their stand spread quickly. Allied commanders called it heroic. Eisenhower himself would later say the success of the Airborne made the invasion possible. But the paratroopers didn't think in those terms. To them, it was just survival. Brotherhood in its purest form. That night, rain pattered softly on their helmets as they dug in outside Carentan. The war moved on, deeper into France, towards the heart of Germany. But for the men who had junked into the dark, Normandy would never fade. Every hedge, every farmhouse, every face lost in the chaos would stay with them long after the shooting stopped. And somewhere in the distance, over the quiet French fields, the wind still carried a faint echo. The roar of engines, the snap of parachutes, and the voice of a young lieutenant shouting, "Go, go, go!" They came from the sky. They fought in the mud. They turned the tide of history. The screaming eagles had done their part, and the world would never forget it.
Snow fell over Bastogne like ashes from a dying fire. The December wind cut through uniforms and flesh alike, biting at the bones of the men who refused to surrender. The 101st Airborne, exhausted, half-frozen and surrounded, stood their ground as the German army closed in from all sides.
The once quiet Belgian town had become the heart of a storm, and every man knew it. It was supposed to be a brief rest after Normandy in Holland, but instead, the Screaming Eagles found themselves trapped in one of the harshest battles of the entire war, the Battle of the Bulge. The enemy threw everything they had at Bastogne: tanks, artillery, endless waves of infantry. Hitler had promised his generals a quick victory. He would split the Allied lines, drive to Antwerp, and turn the war back in Germany's favor. But he didn't count on the Americans holding this tiny frozen town with nothing but grit, courage, and a prayer. Colonel McCulloch's men dug foxholes into the frozen soil, shivering through nights that felt colder than death itself. Supplies ran low: food, ammunition, even medical kits, gone. Planes couldn't drop aid through the snowstorms. The men burned anything they could find to stay warm: old crates, wooden doors, even scraps of enemy gear. And still, they fought. On the morning of December 22nd, a German messenger appeared under a white flag. He carried an ultimatum from the German commander: surrender Bastogne or be annihilated. The paper was formal, almost polite, but the meaning was clear. The Americans were surrounded. They had no chance. McCulloch read the note, took a breath, and then grinned. "Nuts," he said. One word, one message: no surrender. When the Germans received the reply, confusion turned to disbelief. "Nuts," they repeated. "Is that a refusal?" The American officer smiled. "You got it." That single word, short, defiant, perfectly American, became a symbol for the entire war. Against impossible odds, against a force that outnumbered them nearly 5-1, they refused to back down. The artillery began again that night. The sky glowed orange as shells screamed overhead. The ground shook like thunder rolling through the earth. Yet in every trench, every foxhole, men clutched their rifles and whispered to each other, "Hold the line." Some were barely 20 years old, yet they fought like veterans of 100 wars. The wounded refused evacuation. The medics worked in candlelight, wrapping bandages with numb fingers. In the distance, tank engines growled, German tigers prowling through the snow. The Americans waited in silence, rifles ready. When the first German armor broke through the trees, the night erupted in gunfire. Bazookas flared, machine guns roared, and men shouted through the smoke. Each street in Bastogne became a battleground. Houses turned into fortresses, rubble into cover. Every inch of ground was paid for in blood. The 101st Airborne fought like men possessed, not for medals, not for glory, but for each other. "Hold the line," Sergeant Lipton shouted, dragging ammunition through knee-deep snow. "Don't let them through." For days they fought off wave after wave, never knowing when relief would come or if it would come at all. The Germans threw everything they had at Bastogne, but the Americans would not break. Then, in the freezing dawn of December 22nd, a sound echoed across the hills. Deep, rumbling, familiar. Tanks. But not German. "Those are ours," someone yelled. Men scrambled from their foxholes, eyes wide, hearts pounding. Over the ridge came the unmistakable star, the white star of the U.S. Army, painted on the lead tank of General Patton's Third Army. The relief column had broken through the German lines. Against snow, steel, and relentless fire, Patton's men had done the impossible. They reached Bastogne. Cheers erupted through the ruins. Men cried openly, laughing, shouting, hugging each other through the smoke. They were starving, frozen and broken, but alive. They had held the line long enough, and their courage had changed the course of the war. For the Germans, Bastogne was more than a loss. It was a symbol of everything they could not understand: American defiance, the refusal to quit, the strength to fight on even when logic said surrender. Hitler's grand offensive had failed. The Ardennes offensive, his last desperate gamble, was shattered in the snow. For the men of the 101st Airborne, it wasn't just a victory. It was survival. It was brotherhood. They had stared into the heart of war, and refused to blink. When reporters later called them the heroes of Bastogne, most just shrugged. They didn't think of themselves as heroes. They thought of themselves as soldiers doing their duty, one day, one night, one frozen hour at a time. When the battle finally ended and the snow began to melt, the fields around Bastogne were littered with the wreckage of war. Burned-out tanks, twisted rifles, helmets half buried in ice. But among it all, the American flag still stood over the town, torn, frostbitten, but standing, just like the men who raised it. Years later, veterans of the 101st would look back on that winter and remember the sound, the constant roar of artillery, the cries of wounded men, the whisper of snow falling on steel. They would remember friends who never came home, faces lost in the white haze of battle. But they would also remember something deeper, the unbreakable bond forged in that frozen hell, the belief that courage, even in its smallest form, could change the tide of history. And so the legend of Bastogne and the 101st Airborne was written not by generals or politicians, but by ordinary Americans who refused to surrender. The men who turned defiance into victory. The men who stood in the snow and said, simply, nuts. Because in that single word was the essence of the American spirit, fearless, stubborn, and free.
The snow began to melt across Europe, revealing the scars of a continent that had bled for too long. Burned tanks, shattered villages, and fields torn by artillery, reminders of a winter that had nearly broken the Allied front. But it hadn't. Because of Bastogne, because of the 101st Airborne, Hitler's final gamble had failed. The German dream of splitting the Allied lines, of pushing them back into the sea, had frozen to death in the Ardennes. From that moment on, the tide of war no longer turned, it roared forward. The Allies advanced relentlessly, pushing the Wehrmacht back toward the Rhine. Every bridge, every town recaptured carried echoes of Bastogne's defiance. The men who had stood in the snow now marched in the spring, leading the charge toward victory. For the Americans, the lesson was clear. Courage wasn't born in comfort. It was forged in the cold, in the dirt, under fire. The 101st Airborne embodied that truth. Their stand at Bastogne became a symbol not just of military strength, but of something deeper, the unyielding American will to fight for freedom, no matter the cost. As the Allies reached the Rhine, German morale shattered. The Luftwaffe could no longer contest the skies. Their tanks ran dry of fuel. Their lines broke and their cities burned under the relentless precision of American and British bombers. On the ground, GIs advanced through ruined streets, wary but unstoppable. They had seen too much, lost too many, but they pressed on, because every step eastward was one closer to ending the nightmare. By March 1945, the Allies reached the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, the last intact crossing over the Rhine. Against all odds, American troops captured it, opening the gateway into the heart of Germany. Hitler's empire was collapsing from within, its divisions retreating, its leaders in denial. But for the men who had fought in Normandy, Holland, and Bastogne, it was more than a military victory. It was justice. Hard-earned, paid for in blood and brotherhood. When the 101st finally crossed into Germany, they carried no illusions. They had seen what war could do, to men, to cities, to souls. But they also carried pride. They had faced the worst the enemy could offer, and they had endured. The same division that had dropped into chaos on D-Day had now helped bring the war full circle. From the beaches of Normandy to the gates of the Reich. By April, the Allies surrounded Berlin. American and Soviet troops closed in from opposite directions, sealing the fate of the Third Reich. Hitler, once untouchable, now cowered in a bunker beneath the ruins of his own capital. His 1,000-year empire had lasted barely 12. In early May, the guns finally fell silent. The war in Europe was over. Millions rejoiced, in Times Square, in London, in small towns across America, where mothers and wives and children had waited for word that the fighting had ended. But for those who had been there, For the men who fought in the sky and bled in the snow, victory was not celebration. It was relief. It was silence where once there had been fire. For the 101st Airborne, the end came without ceremony. They were soldiers, tired, thin, many of them wounded, but still standing. Their legacy was not written in medals or speeches, but in the freedom they had secured. The bridge at Remagen, the skies over Normandy, the frozen fields of Bastogne, these were the monuments to their courage. In the decades that followed, history would remember the great offensives, the generals, the strategies. But for those who truly knew the war, it was the ordinary Americans, the paratroopers who dropped into darkness, who held a town against an army, who refused to surrender when surrender made sense, who defined victory. When visitors stand today in Bastogne, they see the same forests, the same fields, quiet now, peaceful. But if you listen closely, the wind still carries echoes, the rumble of distant tanks, the crack of rifles, the steady voice of men shouting to hold the line. Because the story of Bastogne isn't just a chapter in a history book. It's a reminder of what happens when ordinary men face impossible odds and refuse to break. The Germans had mocked them, surrounded them, and promised to destroy them. But in the end, it was the Americans who stood victorious, cold, battered, unbroken. The Screaming Eagles had done what the world thought impossible. They had stopped the Nazis, saved the line, and kept the flame of liberty burning through the darkest winter of the war. And when the last plane flew home, when the last rifle was laid down, the world knew one thing for certain. You can challenge America's might, you can test her resolve, but you can never, ever break her spirit. Because in the snows of Bastogne, under fire, and against fate itself, American grit had spoken louder than any army. And the world would never forget it.